The Vanishing City of Homes. It's a project discussing how the historical buildings in Springfield are being destroyed and how this destruction affects the city's rich heritage. Bob McCaroll from Springfield Preservation Trust, David Gaby, who's an historic preservationist, and Margaret Gaby, his daughter, initially wrote about this, and that kind of spawned this whole entire movement. Talk about what initiated this project.
Oh, well, I was an English major at UMass Amherst, and I had a writing class. One of the assignments was to write something about restorative nature, and I, of course, I thought of historic houses because I grew up going in historic houses, being in historic houses, knowing about importance of the historic houses in Springfield. So I wrote a paper about historic houses in Springfield, and I named it Vanishing City of Homes because many of the houses in Springfield are historic, are being torn down as opposed to being preserved.
Now, David, your daughter, you pass this love of historic homes onto your daughter, and it in turn connects with Bob here. Talk about that connection.
Well, I was surprised when Margaret showed me her paper after she wrote it, and I was surprised by how she went back to what was kind of my original context and the context of some of the other people that have been concerned about it. When I was little, 4 or 5 years old, urban renewal was starting. And we had not only urban renewal, but major landmarks like my church, the Church of the Unity, was torn down because the congregation felt, oh, we have to tear it down and build something new. And so many big parts of the city were coming apart that I made up in my head an imaginary thing called the urban renewal bird that would swim up the Connecticut River and eat parts of the town while I wasn't looking. But one of the other things that happened, and one of the focuses of Margaret's paper, was the demolition of the Barney Mansion, which was, I thought, an important landmark when I was little. But then I remember that Bob McCaroll, who's been in preservation for a long time, mentioned that he was involved as a young person trying to save the Barney Mansion.
Bob, most kids are more concerned about outside playing around in the dirt, although nowadays is playing video games. But you were concerned about saving a property.
Yeah, my parents would take me to Forest Park, and one of the highlights of going to Forest Park would be going to the Barney Mansion, which then was a museum. So they had all these nifty stuffed birds in there and live animals and other things that probably weren't of interest to a young kid. And when I heard that it was going to be torn down as part of the interstate system that was being built, I took around a petition in my 6th grade class. Obviously, I wasn't successful.
But you tried, and that's what counts. And that seems to be the common goal of everybody here, is that you're trying to emphasize restoration as opposed to demolition, which is not a very popular agenda for a city. Talk about the struggles that you guys are facing.
Well, I think, on the one hand, you say it's not very popular. It's funny because I'll run into a former mayor, and say, I'm a preservationist. And they'll always say that they're in favor of preservation, but then anytime an opportunity comes up or there's an issue with a building, there's a high school that has a leaky roof, or there's a fire in a house, or something, it's always the first impulse to, let's tear it down. And I think if you look at Springfield as opposed to some other cities, I'm not sure if it's because we went from a group of people who were running everything when everything was built, and it's now changed to different groups who were maybe immigrants at that time, or what. But we have we're less ready to invest resources, we're less ready even to look at alternatives for preservation than we should be, I think.
Bob, what role does the Springfield Preservation Trust play in all of this?
Well, the trust is a private nonprofit organization. It's an all-volunteer group, and one of the things it tries to do is advocate. So when there are historic buildings that are threatened, especially if they're threatened by government action, the Preservation Trust members try to make their voices heard. The trust also tries to educate people. So we do house tours so that people get to see what great old houses we do have. We have a speakers bureau that can go out and talk to people about the, historic preservation.
Now, Margaret, as a young person, you weren't around when these homes that your dad and Bob obviously are familiar with. Why is this so important to you?
Well, I grew up in the McKnight area, the McKnight Historic District, and I don't know, I've seen houses that are very nice and they're not either kept up or they're transformed into a way they're not as appealing to the eye. And I just feel it's important because I also just like old houses, and I want them to be restored, I guess collectively, like the neighborhood, and be respected as important landmarks.
Now, I'm sure you guys can attest to the fact that when the tornado came through, it really took out some of the buildings, but the after effects were probably more damaging, with some buildings, as opposed to being restored, were just being torn down or being forsaken. What effect did that have on the community?
I think it's really been an emotional shock. The tornado was a shock. Everybody felt like, what, tornadoes, Springfield? We were not in Kansas. But then after it happened and it was so devastating, people said, well, okay, I can deal with this. But then people had the experience of trying to deal with it and being blocked. I was part of a historic preservation class at UMass, and we took on a volunteer assignment of cataloging in the South End and the Six Corners area the damaged buildings that were still left at that time, which most of them were still left. And one of the other students had the experience of seeing a guy try to go to his house to fix it and having the police try to arrest him for going to his own house because there was an order that this wasn't to be fixed, or some kind of an order. And so many of those houses that could have been fixed were lost during that period when supposedly FEMA was securing public safety, but it was almost a year, or it was a year, and we could have done a lot. And I think that whole idea of not doing anything and at the same time things are being destroyed was very wearing on a lot of people.
Well, it's definitely interesting to see how this will play out, and good luck in your project. Thank you all so much for being the guests on the show today.
Great, thank you.